Welcome. Thanks for joining. My name is Morgan. I'm the Director of Client Success for On Frontiers, and just wanted to provide a little context about the background of On Frontiers, as well as this webinar and kind of our series of Agile Management for International Development events. So On Frontiers, we're an Agile expertise company, and so our goal is to match our clients with niche subject matter experts on any topic anywhere in the world within 48 hours. Over the last few years, we've worked pretty heavily in the international development space, helping BD teams connect with experts for proposals, as well as supporting active projects. But this year, during the course of our work, we noticed a lot of our clients and partners in the international development space in particular were really beginning to explore what Agile management was, and specifically what it means for companies operating in the international development space, because it's sort of a unique industry. So we decided to kind of pull those threads together and start a more cohesive conversation across the whole industry. So we did a first event in July, which went really well. The feedback from our first event was incredibly positive. But while everyone was really excited to continue the conversation, many asked for a more foundational understanding of kind of the nuances of Agile management, what it means, how it works. So this webinar is really going to focus on how you can be agile within your teams and projects, what that means for communication, planning, and more. And this will help lay the groundwork for a follow-on event we're planning in December. So keep your ears open on that, and that'll focus more on at the institutional level. So organizations will be invited to sponsor up to 3 of their staff to attend a full-day workshop, where we'll really discuss and explore how to move the whole organization to a more agile mindset, come up with some simple experiments we can do within our own organizations to kind of come back and report on, and then create an ongoing network focused on how to explore Agile management for international development together. So that being said, we've got 2 great speakers with us today. Jonas is an Agile coach for Spotify and has done a lot of Agile training. And then Ikeda is a senior financial management specialist with the World Bank and an Agile fellow. So I'll hand it over to Jonas, and he can share a little bit more about his specific experiences.
Thank you for the introduction. As you said, my name is Jonas, and I'm an Agile coach here in Stockholm. I'm the co-owner and senior Agile coach at Redmind. One of my biggest clients throughout the years has been Spotify. I'm currently on my 2nd stint here at the company, and I've been in most parts of this organization. I've been working with both the client and the app. I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I'm currently working in the finance department, both money in and money out, trying to change the harder part of the organization to be more agile as well. When I compare to other clients I've been working with, Spotify has achieved a much higher level of agility than any other. And this can really be seen in the everyday actions of anyone you meet or work with at the company. This is basically why I returned to this place. The responsibility for succeeding it's shared with everyone, and everyone embraces it. That means every time you work on something or with someone, you share a common goal. You're also completely transparent, both up and down within the company, of how things are going and progressing, which means that going back to my earlier days of project management, everyone always has the same information. So there are no knowledge gaps or well, there are some, but there are very few misunderstandings compared to other places I've been working at. This results in a culture of trust rather than fear, because everyone wants everyone else to succeed and will always do whatever they can to help them achieve that. Personally, I enjoy this way of working very much, and I can see the difference in results every time as well. It's not that everything that we do in every project is a success, but rather we minimize the cost of each failure. And by doing that, we can try more things and be successful in more things. I'm quite sure Jan will talk about the value of short iterations, and I completely second that. Everything can be made smaller and should be made smaller, which will make us successful in the end. I'm not sure about all of your backgrounds, but in all different parts of doing business, and everyone wants to be as quick as possible, and everyone wants to be as good as possible. This is always a balance of doing things quickly and doing things with the right amount of quality. Doing things the agile way is basically doing things quick enough that we can always go back and fix the quality afterwards if it's not good enough. And Spotify has really embraced that. Excuse me. Cold times here in Stockholm. Basically, if I can only get you to understand one thing about Agile and Agile at Spotify, it's a sheer joy to work with people on a common goal and to collaborate with anyone you meet at any point. And that is why I've returned to this place more than once. I also picked up a small request earlier on dispersed teams, and I wanted to touch on that because it's something that I've heard a lot throughout the years, that working in co-located teams is a requirement for Agile. And that means basically if you're not in the same place, you can't be Agile. And this is a complete myth, and that's not at all how things work. Being Agile has nothing to do with being physically close. For me, the main point of being Agile is being nimble and able to change direction quickly. In my usual domain, which is IT, this translates to shipping products quickly. And sure, it's easier when we are co-located, but it can still be achieved remotely. I've been part of remote setups that are better than co-located setups and vice versa. The key to unlocking the potential of your team is communication. If you're good at communicating with each other, you will be able to collaborate efficiently. If you can't communicate, no amount of physical closeness will help you. If you're trying to get this started and don't know how, always a small first step is what you need. And I would truly recommend enlisting the help of a coach and get everyone, or as many as you can, involved in one place and do a thorough kickoff. And when doing that kickoff, get to know each other and agree on how to work together. When you spend this time in the beginning, you will get the payoffs later, because each interaction you have after that time will be much easier and better. And now I'll hand it over to John, actually. If you have any questions for me, I'll be around for the Q&A at the end.
Jonas, thank you very much. For everybody listening, I think it's a real treat to hear from somebody who has such an inside view of Spotify. I think he's being a little modest. I mean, every Agile textbook, every Agile article holds up Spotify as an example of one of the most Agile organizations. And I thought it was particularly interesting, Jonas, when you said that it's a joy to work there, to work with people on a common goal, because like we spend 40, 50 hours a day or a week working. It should be fun, right? I mean, you should be enjoying what you're doing. You should feel like you're having impact, that you're working together with other people to achieve a goal. And particularly in international development, where what we're doing is so important. But I think a lot of times organizations get a little bit stuck. And one of the things I like about Agile is it's a way for organizations to work together more for people to work together more effectively and really make it a more fun place to work. So what I'm going to do now is just step through a little bit some of the basics of Agile and how we've applied it at the World Bank. A couple of years ago, we launched a change management initiative called the Agile Bank program, where we were really looking at how to apply the principles of Agile specifically to development work. One of the things we learned early on is that a lot of the materials, a lot of the training is geared very specifically towards IT, which is where this project management tool came out of. But it is very flexible, it's very adaptable, and it's certainly relevant to a lot of the work that we do in development. And it actually aligns very closely with several other big concepts we're seeing now in development around adaptive management, problem-driven iterative adaptation, doing development differently, CLA. These are all things that draw on a lot of the same concepts and principles from Agile. So for those of you who do have a background in Agile, a lot of what I'll be talking about is not a specific flavor. It's not Scrum or XP or Kanban. It's really a mix of all of the different aspects of Agile that we found most relevant in the development setting. So with that, let me go ahead and pull up our presentation here. I first want to talk about cake before we do anything else. Making a cake's a pretty simple problem. Maybe not this cake, right? Because it's pretty fancy looking. But if you have a box of cake mix, everybody agrees, okay, the goal of this exercise is to make a cake. And we follow the directions in the back of the box, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we have cake. A bridge is kind of an extension of that problem, right? In that it's a complicated problem. We still all agree that we need to get from one side of that river to the other. We have a common agreement that the bridge is probably the best way to do it. We don't know how to do it, but you could break it down to a series of steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 733, and you have a bridge. But you need a specific technical expert. You need to bring in an engineering firm, somebody who has experience building bridges, and they come in, they do the feasibility study, they do the plans, they build the bridge. However, raising a child is a complex problem. So not only can you not break it down to a series of steps, right? There's no way you could say, okay, when your child is born, at the age of 18, they're going to look like this, and these are the 5,000 steps that it's going to take to get there. It's all a process of trial and error. And yeah, there's experts and there's books and there's all sorts of different resources, but ultimately, it's just trial and error. You read some things, you talk to some people, you try something. If it doesn't work, you try something else. It's a very different type of problem. So what does this mean for development? Well, the issue is that development is both complicated and complex. There are aspects of both problems in international development. But the issue is that because of the nature of the industry and how the world is changing, more and more of the challenges we're facing are complex, not complicated. So a brief history lesson, right? So you had the first era of development, which very glibly put, basically people got together after World War II, and you had the Marshall Plan, and you had the Bretton Woods institutions created, like the World Bank and the IMF, and everybody got together and said, okay, poor countries need stuff. Let's go out, we're gonna build them some stuff. and they need knowledge transfer. So we're going to take experts, we're going to put them on a plane, we're going to send them out there, they're going to tell them what to do. And a lot of good came from that. You had the Green Revolution, for example, but it was also in some ways very political. Right? This was the background of the Cold War, and so you saw aid as very expressly a political tool. So the end of the Cold War brings us to the second era of development, the Bono Era. Right? You had the Millennium Development Goals, which brought everybody together around a set of very ambitious, still mainly output-oriented goals, but going a little bit further than just putting infrastructure in the ground and knowledge transfer, and really elevating it from a political good to a moral good. And we all started to realize, well, you know what? In this first era of development, we built a lot of stuff that really turned out to be kind of white elephants. So what's missing? Oh, institutions. Institutions are missing. What's that? Well, we're not sure, but institutions are missing. And there's more knowledge that's needed. And this ephemeral element of capacity is missing. So we need to build that capacity. So fast forward into a few years ago, and I believe we're entering a third era of development, where there's this sort of existential crisis. We're asking, well, why do we even do development? We have the shift to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are much, much more ambitious. In my own sector, in water, we went from saying, well, we're just going to make sure everyone has access to water, to then saying that it has to be high quality, it has to be reliable, it has to be sustainable, it has to be low cost. These are infinitely more complex, infinitely more expensive to do. And at the same time, you have declining political will, or declining appetite in a lot of countries to even do development. And in this context, you have a lot of non-state actors rising. On good, you have Gates Foundation, for example, which has more resources than many bilateral donors. And you also have the bad, like organizations like ISIS. And then you also have multinational corporations, who have their own resources, but they're also impacting development in different ways. So what does this mean? Well, basically, the ratio of complicated problems to complex problems is decreasing. A lot of the low-hanging fruit's been taken care of already. A conceptually simple problem to have somebody build a bridge, right? You give them money, you hire an engineering firm that's built 50 bridges before you send them out there. And for higher capacity countries, middle income countries, they can borrow directly on the capital markets. They can go to, hire their own firm to advise them on this. And the issues that are left in many cases are the really challenging, complex problems. And I think a lot of organizations now are struggling with how to deal with this, because the entire aid architecture is set up to solve complicated problems. So the reason you're seeing a lot of these different emerging concepts around adaptive management is to try and build the ability for the aid industry to respond to these complex problems. The good news is that Agile is for complex problems. The bad news is that you can't just do Agile. As an organization, you have to be Agile, right? Otherwise, you get a big mismatch, right? You have the sort of Agile as window dressing, as the sort of bells and whistles of it, of Kanban boards and scrums and huddles and sprints. But underlying it all, if there's an unagile organization, nothing happens. And you have cynicism about the whole idea of trying to do Agile. So today we're going to focus mainly on doing Agile, how you use it as a project management tool. But it's just as important to think about how your organization can be agile. And that's something Morgan mentioned the one-day workshop that we're thinking about doing in December. We're going to dive more into that being agile part there, because that's much more challenging. It's a much bigger and more ambitious project. And so today I want to share a few things around how you can do agile that hopefully you could take back to your own organizations and start applying today. So what does it mean to do agile, right? I mean, that means you've got a set of high-functioning, self-managing teams. I mean, the team decides what they're going to work on. This team is empowered, and they're working in short sprints, as Jonas mentioned, to get feedback from the client early, to fail fast, like they say in startup land. That the sooner you get feedback from the client to know that you're going in the right direction, you can pivot and move in another direction, or you keep working in the same direction. But you're minimizing the amount of rework that you're doing. And finally, there's a lot of introspection, that you're looking at the what of what you're creating, and you're reviewing that feedback you get and understanding how to change it. But you're also constantly evaluating how you're working. And the team is asking itself, okay, what worked, what didn't work, how can we work better together as a team going forward? So an organization that has that happening at the team level helps create a culture of being agile. And at the same time, if you have leadership that's bought into the idea of creating an agile organization, that reinforces the ability to do agile. So an agile organization essentially has a few different key characteristics. And the first one is a ruthless focus on client value. And what I mean ruthless is to say that anything that does not add value for the client, however you define the client, could be the donor. If you're a project implementer, it could be the actual stakeholders on the ground. However you define the client, everything that the organization does should add value for that client in some way. And everybody in the organization should be empowered to say that something isn't, from the janitor to the CEO, right? If there's some initiative that is just somebody's pet project and ultimately it has no direct line with client value, get rid of it and apply that energy, apply those resources towards something that does add client value. Second one is around doing, not documenting. That the purpose of an agile organization is to do things, not to write about them, not to create big manuals or reports, that it's about making change happen. Third one is around empowered staff, right? That the leadership of the organization, it's not command and control. Their job is not to make decisions, not to serve as gatekeepers, not to serve as the people cracking the whip on the teams. That they're delegating the decisions to the lowest possible level, and the team is managing itself. And the role of leadership in this scenario is to provide the guidance, the feedback, the support that they need to unblock obstacles that get in their way, and to, what we say sometimes, eat the risk, right? So you tell the teams, we trust you to make this decision, and if you make the right decision, but there's some risk associated with it, we're going to protect you from the downside risk of that. That's our role as leaders, to address the risk that comes from empowered decision making. A agile organization is flexible, right? They're open to course correction, right? You're not creating a 5 or 10-year plan and then rigidly following that plan regardless of whether it's still the right plan or not. And finally, and this is one that I think a lot of organizations in development can struggle with, is about building a culture of feedback and authenticity, right? The only way that you can improve, the only way you create this culture of continuous improvement by assessing how you work and trying to do better, is by giving and receiving feedback honestly and focusing on the work that we're doing and separating that from feedback about the person. It's not saying you are a bad person, it's saying we could work better together if we tried this. And on authenticity, that means being honest with yourself and with others, right? This whole idea, this whole sort of concept in development that a lot of it is about knowledge transfer means that if you're a technical expert in something, it's very difficult to admit that you don't know something, even outside of your own domain, right? But the honesty is, if it's a complex problem, nobody knows what the answer is at the outset. The only way you can solve a complex problem is trial and error, learning by doing. And what happens is, if people aren't willing to say, you know, I don't know, but let's try this, then it creates a lot of momentum to keep going down a path that might not necessarily be the most effective one. So in terms of doing Agile, let's talk about the project management triangle. So we would all like to be able to maximize all three of these when we do a project, right? The scope, we want to do the biggest, most ambitious thing possible. The schedule, we want to get it done as soon as possible. And the resources, you know, we want to do it for free. So in the real world, you have to optimize and make trade-offs and choices. So you only get two of any three of those sides at any given time. So if you don't care about resources, you can just throw money at the problem. You say, you know what, we want a big project, we need it done now, here's an open checkbook, just get it done. Very few organizations have that luxury, which is what traditional project management is for, right? You say, okay, the scope, we need to build a bridge. We've all agreed the bridge needs to get built. We have X million dollars to build the bridge. And we're going to optimize for those two things, and we're going to draw out a giant Gantt chart. And if there's delays, then the schedule slips, which is fine for complicated problems. I mean, this is traditional project management approaches are well suited for complicated problems. But if you've got a complex problem, you don't necessarily know the scope at the outset, right? It's that process of learning by doing. So this is where Agile project management comes in. You're holding the schedule constant through a series of sprints. You're holding the resources constant. You have a specific team. And the scope can actually scale up or scale down depending on the time that's available, or depending on the amount of work that it takes to deliver within that specific time-boxed sprint of 1 to 2, however many weeks, and the feedback that you get from the client. So essentially you say, we're going to work for 2 weeks on this, and at the end of 2 weeks, it's pencils down, like an exam, and we're going to take this out and get feedback from the client. And the scope might increase, the scope might decrease, but we're holding the schedule constant at all times, and we're holding the resources constant at all times. So what's the advantage of working that way? Well, because you're working in these 2-week sprints and then going out and getting feedback from the client on whether what you're doing makes sense or not, whether it adds value for them, you're getting early and frequent feedback, which actually, and this was a hard concept for a lot of people to get their head around when we launched the Agile Bank program, is you can actually get a better product and happier clients in less time, right? I cannot repeat this enough. Agile is not about doing the same thing you are doing faster. It is about a different way of working that gets earlier and more frequent feedback. So what happens a lot of times, if you apply a traditional project management approach to a complex problem, you get something like this. Client comes to you and they say, you know, I really want a painting of the Mona Lisa. Okay, well, what's it look like? I don't know. I mean, there's a woman, she's got kind of a sly smile, and I don't know, something like that. Okay. So team goes back, work, and then they're finished. And they take it to the client at this point to get feedback after they worked for months on this portrait. And it took them a long time, and the client's not happy. They say, you know, I didn't know what I wanted at the beginning, but it wasn't that. So an Agile approach works like this. Come back and say, oh, I want a Mona Lisa, and it's a woman, she's got kind of a sly smile. Okay. So something like this. You take it to the client, you show it to them, and they say, yeah, I mean, okay, yeah, but give me more color. Okay, how about something like this? Say, yeah, okay, I think we're on the right track, but give me more detail. All right, well, how about like this? I say, yeah, you're on the right track. Okay, now just give me a little bit more resolution, make it a little bit sharper, and there you go, the Mona Lisa. So not only do you have a happier client, because you've been engaging with them along the way and getting their feedback as you go, you should do it in less time because you're not doing rework and trying to fix what they didn't like the first time. So how do you actually do this? How do you make this work in organization? Before I get into the nuts and bolts of how a sprint works, I want to talk more about teams because teams are the backbone of what makes Agile work. Without effective teams, you cannot do Agile, full stop. So 5 principles for Agile teams. First, form teams in a way that supports success. One of my favorite things I learned about Amazon is that the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, has what he calls the 2 pizza rule, which is that no team should be bigger than a group of people who could comfortably share 2 pizzas. So this keeps the team size manageable, which is important because the more people you have in a team, the more communication paths there are. The more communication paths there are, the more risk there is that you'll have miscommunication or people who don't have the full story. But when you have that full transparency that Jonas talked about, where everybody knows what everybody else is doing, the team can be much more effective, right? Second is less teams are better than more teams, right? In a lot of organizations, people get pulled into a lot of different projects and they're working with multiple groups of people. But if you look at all the research on how teams function, you're most efficient when you're working on 1, maybe 2 teams. So like 2 projects with 2 different sets of people. By the time you get to when you're working on 8 different teams, you actually spend more time on the switching costs of remembering, okay, we were going to meet on this date. I have to deal with these emails. I have to coordinate this. I have to juggle my schedule so that I can go on this trip. You spend more time on the switching costs than you actually do working. And finally, stable teams are better than fluid teams. It takes time for teams to hit their rhythm, to understand everybody's strengths and weaknesses, how they like to work. And the process they call this sometimes is forming, storming, norming, and performing. So you build the team, there's tension as they try and figure each other out. There's norming as they start to agree on what their team norms are, how they work together. And once they've agreed on that, you start to see them perform. The longer they're together, the better they actually perform. And which is usually about the time that we disperse the team, right? Or that we divide it up and everybody goes and works on different projects, which is the least effective way to do it. So you've got a team together, you've got a group of people, common goal. It's a small team, they're not overstretched, it's stable. Second principle, ensure the right mix of skills. You need to make sure that everybody has the right skills that the project needs to succeed. And if you look at a traditional development project, a lot of it is not deeply technical. A lot of it's fairly generalizable, right? It's project management, it's accounting, it's M&E, it's sort of basic subject matter related to whatever the project is working on. And then there's stuff that needs deep subject matter expertise, right? So in my own sector, water, you might need to bring in somebody who's the world's leading expert on river basin management or reducing non-revenue water. But most of the time, if you have a team of fairly fungible, generalizable people working on the project, you can move the ball forward. So the core team members, you want them to be what's called T-shaped. What that means is everybody has a common set of baseline skills. And then people go deeper into a specific area, right? So for example, on the teams I'm working on, I'm the finance expert, but I'm also fungible enough that I can work across a number of different areas. And the reason you want this is because with an Agile project, because it's complex and because you don't necessarily know what the scope is going to look like, you want to be able to shuffle people around, right? So that if you're working on a monitoring and evaluation plan and it turns out to be way more work, then the other people can pitch in and help out. And so everybody's balancing out their workload. And if you do need to bring in a technical specialist from outside, you want to keep them not fully utilized, right? If they're 70% billable to 8 different projects, then they start to get into those switching costs issues I mentioned earlier. So you got the team, you got the right mix of skills. Now, that team has to agree on their norms. And Google did a massive study of their teams in what was called the Rework Project. And these are the 5 things that a team needs to succeed. And the first 3 are related to norms. And meaning and impact are really, this is at the broader sort of being Agile level. I won't talk about those. But let's talk about these first 3 here. So psychological safety. This means people are comfortable taking risks. This is what I was talking about earlier about authenticity and feedback. This idea that I feel safe to say to my team members, I'm not sure if this is going to work, but we should try this. And I'm not going to be penalized for that. I should feel comfortable telling my teammate that I need help, that I'm stretched, and I really need to get some help in taking on this task. It doesn't seem like you've got a full workload. Do you mind helping me out? Second is dependability. I know that if I ask you to help me, that you'll commit to delivering as best you can. And finally is around structure and clarity, that everybody has a common goal. Everybody believes in this goal and they're working towards it. And everybody understands that they're on a team. A lot of time when you have teams in development projects, they're very nebulous. There's some people that are kind of half in, half out of the team. It's unclear what their role is. So getting aligned on the roles and responsibilities early is critical. Next, get the team together, they've got the right skills, they have the right norms in place, then they're communicating. So they're communicating effectively and frequently. And one of the ways they do that is by focusing on what's called high bandwidth communication. This is the communication that brings the most information for the amount of time it takes. And typically face-to-face interaction is the most high bandwidth form there is, with a very long email that you send out being the least efficient way to convey information. And then you have a lot of different tools in between there. And this is where I think some people in development struggle is, if face-to-face is the highest bandwidth way of working, how do you get around that? Well, frequent video conferences, as much frequent travel to be together and co-located as your budget allows. But certainly, as Jonas mentioned, there have been plenty of remote teams, plenty of dispersed teams that do Agile effectively. And as long as you're focusing on maximizing opportunities for high bandwidth communication, you can still make these remote teams work. But it's better to meet more frequently. And this is the concept behind what are called huddles or scrums in Agile, that rather than having a gigantic planning meeting once every couple of weeks where everybody sits down for 4 hours and then immediately forgets what we all agreed on when we leave the room, you check in for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or 30 minutes, much more frequently than that. You keep the momentum going, which is critical. In Agile, it's about maintaining a momentum, maintaining a pace that is sustainable, but is not burning people out, which leads us to the last principle, that you have to manage the workload for maximum performance. A lot of times in development, we get a sort of boom and bust thing where crank, you work overtime, you know, we're going to get this project done by this deadline. And then there's amount of recovery time where people actually, their productivity dips far below. And if you average it all out, you have total lower average output than you would if everybody agreed, you know, this is our sustainable pace. We're going to maintain this. And it goes back to a saying in Agile, to go fast but never hurry, right? We're trying to maintain that agility. We're trying to focus on getting through these 2-week sprints. But if everybody's staying up until midnight every night in order to do this, that's a red flag that the way that people are working together is not working. And so at the end of the sprint, when everybody sits down and says, well, how did that sprint go? First thing is, well, why are we working until midnight? What's the root cause of this? And how do we fix it so we're not doing that on the next sprint? So now you got this team together. They're high functioning, they're self-managing. Here's how they work together to get feedback from clients early in the process. And this is, again, a mix of different flavors of Agile. This is what we've found to work in the development context at the World Bank. I would recommend anybody who's thinking of doing this to, you know, read broadly a lot of the different resources that are available, to take the trainings that are available. You can think about something like a, you know, Scrum certification, but it's very adaptable, it's very flexible, and to try and change the tools of Agile to be relevant to what your organization needs, and not to try and follow something that's very doctrinaire that honestly was originally designed for software, which is a very different context and a very different set of problems that they're solving. So you got the team together. And in that team, you have one person who's designated the Scrum Master, or you could call him the project manager, you call him whatever you want. If Scrum Master is a term that's going to be somewhat alienating to people in your organization. Essentially, they're the person who manages the process of the sprint. You also have somebody called a product owner. And this is the person who represents the voice of customer. If you can't go to the client directly and get feedback on what you're working on, you're getting the feedback from this person. They're the proxy for the client. And in development, because we have so many different stakeholders and clients, this is the person who is aggregating all of those different viewpoints and trying to maximize across all of them. So let's say that you're working on, I'll give you an example from my own work. You're helping a country develop their national water strategy. So the product owner is the person who is representing the different stakeholders and the government in this case. And they say, well, what does this strategy look like? So we sit down, we build out this task backlog. And say, well, the strategy is going to need to assess who are the water service providers across the entire country. It's going to need to look at the water resources available. It's going to need to understand, you know, what's the money coming into the sector. So you literally write down all the different things that this strategy is going to have in it in order to be successful. But if you just started cranking away on that, and then 7 months later, you put down a draft strategy that has all of these things in it, it might not actually be what they want. You might come back to that Mona Lisa picture. So what you do is you have a sprint planning meeting. So the team gets together with the product owner and, you know, other stakeholders as needed, and say, okay, in the next 1 to 4 weeks, in this next sprint, which of these can we realistically do? What's the most important? What will get us to what's called a minimum viable product, something we can share with the client in order to get feedback. And so you take those tasks, you pull those out, you put them into what's called the sprint backlog. And then the team starts working on them. Now, once those tasks are selected, once the sprint starts, the product owner is not allowed to change that. At this point, the team is self-managing. If they decide that something needs to change, they can, but the product owner is not the boss. the key element of Agile is that that team is self-managing. That team owns this product. And they don't just go off by themselves and crank away in a cubicle and work on their own little bit of it. They're working together effectively as a team on delivering these aspects, delivering these tasks jointly, right? So the way they do that is through huddles or scrum meetings, sometimes they're called. And so this is a daily or every couple days, whatever pace makes sense for the work you're doing, meeting where people get together, and it's very tactical. They're literally just looking at this list of tasks and saying, okay, you're doing this, you're doing this, you're doing this. What's the status on it? Is it done? Okay, great. Move on to the next one. I'm going to take the lead on this. You take the lead on that. It's not about brainstorming. It's not about blaming. It's not about problem solving. It's not about blue sky thinking. It's purely tactical. And it's one of the really brilliant things I think about Agile is it lets you switch back and forth between strategic and tactical. So you have these meetings at the beginning where you plan, and that allows you to get more strategic and think big picture and say, like, is this moving us towards the vision that the client's laid out? But then you get to work and you don't have these kind of big picture 50,000-foot thoughts during the sprint. You're just focusing on delivering the tasks that you've agreed to do. And then at the end, you have something you can share with the client. So going back to that example of a water strategy, maybe it's an executive summary, maybe it's a PowerPoint presentation. It's something that you can prepare in that 1 to 4 week sprint where you can take it out and get real feedback from it. And so then the product owner or the client or whichever stakeholders need to be in that room, review that product, they get feedback, say, okay, yeah, this is on the right path, or no, this isn't what I wanted at all. So the team takes that information and they go back to the next sprint planning meeting and they do it again. And you keep going through these cycles until you've delivered a product that the client is happy with. And maybe initially when we started doing this, we thought this water strategy would need to focus on these 5 things, and it needed to be a 200-page report that was very richly analytical. And it turns out they just want 10 pages of here's the 5 most important things you need to focus on in the water sector for the next 3 years. The final part of this is that sprint retrospective. And this is where the team gets together and thinks about the how. So they say in the last 2 weeks or 4 weeks, however long the sprint was, what worked, what didn't work, and what are we going to change next time? We're not going to change everything. We're just going to change 1 thing or 2 things, right? Because you don't want to do an entirely new process every time. It's just about continual improvement. And incrementally each time, the team gets a little bit better. So I know there's a lot to take in. So I'm going to leave everybody with one simple thing that hopefully you could start applying immediately after the workshop today. And you don't even necessarily need to have fully Agile team together or anything else. So typically the way Agile teams have their huddles and have these daily check-in meetings is they use something called a Kanban board. And this comes from auto manufacturing in Japan, actually. It's a tool from the 80s. And it's just a very simple task management board where tasks move from left to right on a physical whiteboard, on sticky notes, or you can use a virtual whiteboard program. I'm a huge fan of Trello. It's a free program. It's great for remote teams. And literally all you're doing is just moving those stickies from right to left. So on the left side, to do is your sprint backlog. Doing is the work that's in process. And then done is stuff that's done, obviously. And your goal is to move all of those sticky notes or all of those little boxes in Trello from the left to the right. And so every day or every couple of days, the team meets for 10 or 15 minutes and they just run through all of those things. And they say, okay, you're doing this, what's the status? Okay, it's done, move it to the right. Okay, now I'm gonna take on this one. So we assign this task to John. And then the final part is to identify bottlenecks. We say, well, you know what, I was supposed to work on this, but I don't have a software license because I need, specialized statistics software to look at. Okay, so I'll figure out how to go and get that. But you don't sit there and churn on a task when there's a bottleneck that you yourself can't solve. You ask for help early. So I want to leave enough time for Q&A. So I'll run through these last ones very, very quickly. But you've been thinking a lot about when is Agile project management most useful in development. So being Agile, always relevant for any organization working in development. It's not necessarily the right tool for project management. It's much more useful when it's something that is complex, right? Or it's like a startup kind of environment. So for like a strategy, for diagnostic, for an evaluation, or if you're doing something that's like a startup, or you're doing something somebody hasn't tried before, like a pilot test, or project startup, something that's time-bound, something that needs to move quickly, it's more useful. It's less useful if you're managing a big infrastructure project. You can't use Agile to build a bridge. If you're scaling up something that you know that works, it's probably not as useful a tool. It can be used with ongoing programs, with back office management. Jonas mentioned he's working with their finance department at Spotify, but it's more challenging because it's not project-based work. Project-based work lends itself to Agile because it's more contained. But there's certainly elements of it that are still relevant. Finally, next steps, if you wanted to try and use Agile in your own work, I would recommend starting by just learning. There's a lot of different resources available. We're going to distribute these slides, and I can also add a few different articles and resources that are worth taking a look at. Second is to assess, to look at your organization and ask, how agile are we already? How open are people going to be to a different way of working? Third, to identify, to start small, fail fast. Just like Agile itself, when you're testing Agile, you don't want to do a big company-wide initiative right away. At the World Bank, we picked 3 pilot units to focus on for the first year and a half of the project. And we learned from that before we scaled it up bank-wide. I test it. Say, you know what, for this project startup or this report or this proposal we're developing for a donor, we're going to try using Agile project management for this with a small team. We treat it as an experiment, right? It's not, if it doesn't work, that's great, we'll try something else. If it does work, we're going to review it, we'll learn from it, and we'll try expanding that test a little bit further. So that's the very basics of it. This could easily be days, and it's been a long journey for us trying to figure out how to adapt Agile for development. But I do genuinely believe that for the biggest, most complex development challenges we're facing, which is more and more of them, it is an incredibly useful tool, and it's one that ultimately, I think, leads to better outcomes more efficiently. So, as I mentioned, we'll be having a one-day workshop with organizations in December that's going to focus more on the being Agile aspects of it. If you're interested in that, if you think there's appetite for it in your organization, I highly recommend reaching out to Morgan to learn more. So with that, I think we've got about 6 minutes left to answer any questions that anybody has. I think, Morgan, you've been tracking some of the ones that have come in via chat.
Yeah, thanks, John. And Jonas, appreciate both of you guys for sharing on this and running through things. John, one of the questions I wanted to start out with, which actually came in before, and Jonas, this would be great for either of you. It came in actually in one of the registration, one of the registrations was specifically there was kind of a mention about how Agile was built for software development. and has since been taking hold in a number of different places, and how there are some aspects that are sort of universal and some aspects are more specific to software development. And so I was wondering if you guys could share a little bit more details on what is the same and what is different.
Yeah, very quickly on my side, and then I'll kick it over to Jonas. I think for us, what we found the main thing was, one, the terminology. A lot of it can be a little bit alien and off-putting to people when you start talking about Scrum Masters and Kanbans, and calling it whatever people are going to be comfortable with in your organization is part of it. And the other one is around the sprint length. 2 weeks is the standard sprint length in software development, because you can move pretty quickly to get a prototype. Sometimes, if you're working very, very quickly, a shorter sprint might make more sense in a development context. And in other cases, when it's a big, ambitious project, maybe you need a 4-week sprint. I don't think I'd go much longer than 4 weeks, but certainly being flexible on the length of the sprint we found was very important.
Yeah, I would say most things are applicable in any domain, but the basic principles for me is focusing on customer value. That has nothing to do with your domain. Starting where you are and working from that point, same thing there. And I think John mentioned this as well, the value of retrospectives and continuously improving your work. These are like the key principles of Agile for me, and they can be applied to any domain.
Perfect. Thank you both. One of the other common questions that we get is, again, specifically in international development. So this would be more for you, John, and kind of the difference of, how do you work on an Agile team and kind of develop an Agile methodology focused on the product and that customer, that voice of the customer aspect that you're talking about, when you have this kind of divided approach of the money coming from a funder, but the end user and customer and beneficiary themselves maybe being not the one that has the money. So how do you develop? Where do you get the client feedback from, and how does that process look for Agile teams in international development?
It's a great question, and it's a big challenge that I think we see in adapting Agile in a development context, because with a software project, it's very clear who the client is. And you do have multiple stakeholders in pretty much any development project. I would say a lot of it is about us as donors, bringing in more agility and working more in partnership with implementers to focus on the ultimate client on the ground, right, the beneficiary. And the good news is, I think a lot of donors are moving towards a more collaborative approach. Particularly, I think USAID and DFID have really focused on much more adaptive approaches, much more iterative approaches to project design that bring in that voice of the client early on. But certainly there's no easy answers, and part of it, I think, is as you think about how to roll out Agile in your organization, is to find those areas where you have the most control over the client, and which is why we explicitly focused on internal processes in the first couple of years of the project and of the Agile Bank program. We looked at how we manage travel and work trips. We looked at how we actually do sort of processing on the loans that we provide. And now that we're sort of feeling a little bit more confident in how to apply it, we're looking outwards a little bit more, and we're looking at how do we work together with clients to develop the loan, the projects that are going to be financed by us in a more collaborative, more agile manner.
Great, and kind of on that same page, we just got a question about the CLA approach specifically, and kind of the movement towards the CLA approach, which has been derived from the ideas of Agile, but the practical implications tend to be more difficult than kind of the theory of it. So if you have any thoughts on specific case studies that you know of that have kind of used that methodology effectively, and kind of what some best practices are in that?
I'm less familiar with CLA, but I do think, I mean, the general framework, collaborate, learn, adapt, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. I think the key is to make sure that everybody working on it is genuinely bought into it. There's a concept that they use sometimes in adaptive management called isomorphic mimicry. And this comes from biology, where non-poisonous animals will sometimes evolve to have the same markings as similar animals that are poisonous. Right? So you have a snake that's not poisonous, but it evolves over time to look just like the one that's venomous. And so you have that same sort of isomorphic mimicry in development sometimes, where organizations or governments will have the trappings of capacity, but underneath it, it's not. It's that isomorphic mimicry. So it's the same thing with CLA. If people aren't really bought into it, then it's not effective, because ultimately, you know, there'll be cynicism about it and it won't work. So making sure before you go through any project that everybody really believes in this, that any concerns about it are addressed, is really critical. And unfortunately, I don't have any particular case studies just because I'm not as familiar with that side of it. But yeah, the buy-in is critical.
Yeah, thanks. And a couple notes on that. If for anybody that's joining, participating, if you do have examples of those kind of case studies, best practices that you'd like to share with everybody, feel free to send those along to me, and we can pass them along to everybody else as well. And kind of on that note, John, we got another question about, as you're working on creating these agile approaches, and Jonas, for you too, with you know, doing the trainings and coaching for agile. As you're starting it, how do you share, like, how do you get people on board in the beginning, more than just this sort of, you know, mimicry and kind of superficial support? How do you actually get teams to commit to doing sort of the first couple pilot sprints and exploring what agile can mean, and really dive into that experimental process?
Well, I'll mention briefly and then kick it over to Jonas. But one of the reasons that we had Spotify here today was for exactly that reason. What we found early in the Agile Bank program was that hearing from organizations that have done this is the most effective way to get people excited. And you know, we actually took our senior management and we took them to ING Bank, we took them to Spotify, we took them to Export Development Canada, these organizations that are really held up as examples of agility. You know, for them to see it and feel it firsthand, because when you come into a high-performing organization, and you can literally feel it, the atmosphere feels different, the way people interact feel different. And so when people get that sense of it and they start to say, well, I want my organization to work like that, you know, that's really how you build the excitement for it. And then from there, you know, you start very small. Don't try and do a company-wide rollout. Just say, we're gonna run this as an experiment. Low risk, we're gonna try it, see if it works. If it works, we'll try it again. If not, we'll try something else.
Yeah, I completely agree with John here. The approach of showing someone that has done it and they're doing it well, just to showcase, okay, this is what we're aiming for. And then starting small, I would also add the part of adding a small voluntary team, if possible. We could say, we're rolling out a pilot team for this. We want 4 to 8 volunteers for it, basically. And then you do what you can do, and you're going to show the results. Probably you're not going to get a result, but you're going to get happy people doing it, which in turn is going to lead you to better results down the line. But the key, as Jan said, starting small as you possibly can, and then iterating from that point.
Perfect. Thank you guys both again for sharing and you know, sharing some of your experiences, answering some questions. We've gone a few minutes over, so we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. But thank you everybody for joining, for participating, for the questions that you got. As John mentioned, we'll follow up with some of the resources, including the deck that he ran through, so you can run through that. This was recorded as well, so we'll share that with you. So if other people on your teams wanted to join but weren't able to because of other commitments, you know, they can watch the webinar, and then we'll also follow up as well with some of the other resources on how to get started, some reading and other examples of successful projects and things. We're getting some ideas that have come in, so we'll try to share those. And then we'll be in touch and follow up on the event in December as well as more details come in. But thank you all, and hope you guys have a great day.